The pilots had been told their P-38 Lightnings were the finest twin-engine fighters ever built, machines of such technological superiority that no Japanese Zero could match them in the vast blue arena above the Pacific. They had memorized the specifications like scripture: maximum speed of 400 miles per hour, a ceiling that scraped 40,000 feet, firepower concentrated in the nose that could saw a bomber in half. But here, in the suffocating heat of New Guinea in 1943, with sweat pooling beneath their oxygen masks and their hands trembling on the control yokes, they watched Zeros dance circles around them, watched their squadron mates spiral down in flames, watched the myth of American technological dominance shatter like canopy glass struck by 20mm shells. Captain Tommy Maguire knew the statistics by heart, had recited them to himself during the long flight from California, but statistics meant nothing when a Zero sat on your tail, its rounds walking up your fuselage while your P-38 wallowed through a turn like a pregnant whale. The contradiction ate at him during the humid nights when sleep wouldn't come, when the mosquito netting above his cot swayed in the fetid breeze, and the memory of friends' voices echoed from empty bunks. They had been taught that superior machinery would win this war, that American engineering and industrial might would overwhelm the primitive fanaticism of their enemies. But here, in the actual sky where theory met reality, their sophisticated lightnings were being carved apart by planes made of wood and fabric, planes that shouldn't even be able to compete. The heat in the maintenance tents was a living thing that pressed against the mechanics like a physical weight, turning simple tasks into endurance tests. Sergeant Michael Mickey Stankowski wiped the sweat from his eyes for the 100th time that morning, leaving another streak of hydraulic fluid across his forehead. He had grown up in Detroit, in the shadow of the auto plants, where his father had worked the line at Ford and taught him that every machine had a soul, a particular way it wanted to run. The P-38 seconds scattered across the coral runway were beautiful machines, their twin booms gleaming in the merciless sun. But something was wrong with them, something that went deeper than mechanical failure. He listened to the pilots talk when they returned from missions, their voices hollow with exhaustion and something worse, shame. They spoke of Zeros that could turn inside them, climb faster despite having half the horsepower, dance through the air while the P-38 seconds lumbered. Lieutenant Jim Peterson, barely 22 with a wife's photo tucked in his breast pocket, described how he had lined up a perfect shot on a Zero, only to watch it flip over and reverse direction in the time it took him to squeeze the trigger. "It's like fighting smoke," Peterson said, and Stankowski heard his voice crack. "We've got all this power, all these guns, and we can't touch them." The official reports blamed pilot error, insufficient training, the need for better tactics. The brass in Brisbane issued memorandums about maintaining altitude advantage and avoiding turning fights. But Stankowski knew machines, and he knew when a machine wasn't doing what it was capable of doing. He spent his nights going over the P-38's manual by candlelight, the pages already soft from humidity, comparing the specifications to what he observed during the day. The engines were producing their rated power he had checked and rechecked. The control surfaces moved freely, yet something fundamental was being lost between potential and performance. It was the crew chief from the 80th Squadron, an old-timer named Harvey, who first mentioned Charles Lindbergh's name, not as a hero of aviation's golden age, but as someone who might understand what they were missing. Lindbergh had been visiting Pacific bases, ostensibly as a civilian technical representative for United Aircraft, though everyone knew his presence meant more than that. When word came that he would spend a week with their group, the pilots received it with skepticism. What could a man who had crossed the Atlantic in 1927 teach them about fighting Zeros in 1943? Lindbergh arrived on a Tuesday morning when the heat was already shimmering off the coral runway in waves that made the distant jungle dance. He was 41 years old, his famous boyish face now weathered and serious, wearing civilian khakis that looked out of place among the olive drab. The pilots watched him walk around their P-38 seconds with an expression of intense concentration, running his hands along the wings, peering into the engine nacelles, saying nothing for so long that some began to whisper he was wasting their time. But Stankowski watched Lindbergh's eyes, saw how they tracked the control cables, how they lingered on the propeller hubs, how they studied the angle of the elevator trim tabs. This was a man who understood flight not as a set of procedures but as a conversation between pilot and machine. When Lindbergh finally spoke, his voice was quiet, forcing everyone to lean in. "You're flying these birds like bombers," he said, "using maybe 60% of what they can do." The first thing he taught them seemed absurd in its simplicity. The P-38 seconds had been arriving from the factory with their throttle controls rigged to prevent what engineers considered overboost, limiting manifold pressure to protect the engines. But Lindbergh had discovered, through careful experimentation and a deep understanding of the Allison engines, that they could safely exceed these limits for combat power. He showed them how a simple adjustment to the throttle linkage, a piece of wire no longer than a man's finger, could unlock another 10 inches of manifold pressure. Lieutenant Peterson was the first to try it, his P-38 roaring down the runway with a sound the mechanics had never heard before, a deep-throated bellow that made the coral dust swirl in new patterns. When he returned from his test flight, his face was flushed not with heat but with something like wonder. "She climbed," he said, struggling to find words. "Really climbed. Like she was angry at being held back all this time." But it wasn't just the wire. Lindbergh understood something about efficiency that had been trained out of the military pilots, who had been taught to fly by the book, to treat the manual's specifications as inviolable law. He showed them how to lean the fuel mixture far beyond what they had been told was safe, how to reduce RPM while maintaining manifold pressure, how to coax an extra 200 miles of range from their tanks. The pilots' minds could not reconcile this with everything they had been taught at flight school, where instructors had warned that such practices would destroy engines, cause detonation, leave them stranded over the Pacific. Stankowski found himself assigned to Lindbergh's personal crew, responsible for maintaining the P-38 that the famous aviator flew on demonstration missions. It should have been just another civilian technical representative's aircraft, but Lindbergh insisted on flying combat missions, though officially he was forbidden from doing so. The wire modification was just the beginning. Lindbergh worked with Stankowski and the other mechanics late into the humid nights, adjusting control cable tensions, experimenting with different propeller pitch settings, adding washers to change the angle of trim tabs by fractions of degrees. Each modification seemed insignificant on its own, a wire here, a washer there, an adjustment that might save 5 gallons of fuel or add 10 miles per hour to cruise speed. But together, they transformed the P-38 from a lumbering giant into something more like what its designers had envisioned. The plane still couldn't turn with a zero, nothing could, but it no longer needed to. With the extra power from the wire modification, it could climb faster, strike from above, escape in a dive that would tear a Zero's wings off. The psychological effect on the pilots was as dramatic as the mechanical improvements. They had been fighting not just the Japanese, but their own machines, held back by conservative specifications designed by engineers who had never seen combat, never felt a Zero's cannon shells punching through aluminum skin. Now they understood that they had been given a thoroughbred forced to run in hobbles. The shame of their earlier defeats began to transform into something else: anger at having been handicapped, determination to show what they could really do. Word of the modifications spread through the squadron like flame through dry kunai grass. Other mechanics came to learn from Stankowski, taking notes on scraps of paper, measuring the exact length of wire needed, the precise angle of adjustment. It became known simply as the wire trick, though it was more than that. It was a philosophy of pushing machines and men beyond artificial limits, of trusting experience over theory. The Japanese pilots noticed the change almost immediately. Radio intercepts picked up their confused chatter about P-38 seconds that climbed faster than before, that appeared at altitudes where they shouldn't be, that struck and vanished before the Zeros could react. Captain Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces, would later write in his memoirs about this period, describing his bewilderment at facing P-38 seconds that seemed like entirely different aircraft from those he had easily bested months before. McGuire, who had arrived in the Pacific, convinced of American technological superiority only to have that faith shattered, now found it rebuilt on different foundations. It wasn't the technology alone that mattered, but understanding how to use it, how to push past the conservative boundaries set by distant authorities. He began keeping a notebook of his own modifications and techniques, things that would never appear in an